The first sign something had gone catastrophically wrong came through static at 3:47 hours. Master Sergeant Rodriguez yanked off his headset in the AWACS control center, his face draining of color as he stared at the green phosphor displays that had just gone dark. 24 hours earlier, Operation Nightfall had been textbook perfect, a surgical strike deep into enemy territory to extract high-value intelligence. The mission briefing had been clinical, methodical, almost boring in its precision. 4 F-22 Raptors providing air superiority, 2 Navy SEAL teams on the ground, complete radio silence once they crossed the line of departure, no communication until exfiltration. That was the plan. Now, as dawn broke over the mountains of northern Afghanistan, the silence had become something else entirely, a void that swallowed hope and left only questions. The F-22s had vanished from radar contact 6 hours ago, somewhere over the Hindu Kush. The SEALs had missed their first 2 check-in windows. Command had lost contact with an entire strike package worth more than $500 million, and nobody could explain how. Colonel Marcus Webb stood in the operations center, his weathered hands gripping a ceramic mug that had long since gone cold. 30 years of military service had taught him to read between the lines of sanitized briefings and carefully worded situation reports. This wasn't just a communications blackout. This was something unprecedented, something that made seasoned intelligence officers speak in hushed tones and avoid direct eye contact. "Sir," Rodriguez called out, his voice cutting through the low murmur of activity. "We're picking up intermittent signals from the target area, encrypted burst transmissions, but they're not using our frequencies." Webb moved closer to the communications console, watching as spectral analysis software tried to decode the mysterious signals. The patterns were unlike anything in their databases, sophisticated, layered, and transmitted with a power signature that suggested military-grade equipment. But whose military? And why were they broadcasting from the exact coordinates where America's most advanced fighter jets had disappeared? In the distance, barely audible over the hum of electronics and air conditioning, came the distinctive whine of turboprop engines spooling up. Through the reinforced windows of the operations center, Webb could see maintenance crews working frantically around a single A-10 Thunderbolt II, an aircraft that most pilots called the Warthog, and that most military planners considered obsolete in an age of stealth fighters and precision-guided munitions. The pilot walking toward that ungainly machine carried herself with the measured confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove and everything left to lose. Her flight suit bore the name Viper on the chest tape, and beneath it, service ribbons that told a story of valor most would never fully understand. Major Katerina, Viper, Volkov had been officially grounded for the past 18 months, her flying status suspended pending an investigation that would probably never reach a conclusion. But as the sun climbed higher over the Afghan mountains, and as the silence from Operation Nightfall stretched into its 7th hour, obsolete aircraft and disgraced pilots suddenly looked like the only options left on the table. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who understood the bureaucratic machinery of modern warfare. Sometimes the military's greatest assets were the ones it had already written off. Viper ran her pre-flight checklist with mechanical precision, her fingers dancing across switches and gauges in a routine burned into muscle memory by thousands of hours in cockpits that most people considered flying coffins. The A-10 wasn't pretty, wasn't fast, and wasn't sophisticated. But it was reliable, it was tough, and it could fly low enough to see the whites of an enemy's eyes. In a world of satellites and sensors and computer-guided missiles, sometimes the oldest tools were still the sharpest. Colonel Webb's voice crackled through her headset as she completed engine start procedures. "Viper, I want to be clear about your mission parameters. You are authorized for reconnaissance only. No engagement without direct authorization from this command center. Your primary objective is to locate our missing assets and report their status. Do you understand these instructions?" She keyed her mic with deliberate slowness. "Roger, Colonel," reconnaissance only. But there was something in her voice, a subtle edge that suggested her interpretation of those orders might be more flexible than intended. The A-10's twin General Electric turbofans wound up to full power, their sound less a roar than a growl, like some prehistoric predator awakening from a long sleep. Viper had always loved this moment, the transition from earthbound machine to airborne weapon, the subtle shift in perspective that came with leaving the ground behind. But today felt different. Today carried the weight of unfinished business and unanswered questions. As she lifted off from Bagram Airfield, climbing into the thin mountain air with the deliberate patience of an aircraft designed for endurance rather than speed, Viper couldn't shake the feeling that she was flying into more than just enemy territory. She was flying into the kind of situation that ended careers, broke families, and left classified files buried in Pentagon basements for decades. The GPS coordinates for the F-22s, last known position, glowed softly on her heads-up display, a waypoint marking the edge of everything the American military thought it understood about air superiority and technological dominance. Beyond that waypoint lay questions that nobody wanted to ask and answers that nobody was prepared to hear. In the operations center, Master Sergeant Rodriguez monitored Viper's progress on a bank of screens that showed her aircraft as a slow-moving blip against the digital landscape of Afghanistan's northern provinces. Her flight path took her over valleys where Soviet helicopters had crashed decades earlier, their rusted hulks serving as monuments to the hubris of superpowers who thought superior technology guaranteed victory. Colonel Webb stood beside Rodriguez, watching the same displays with the grim fascination of a man who understood that history often repeated itself in ways that military academies never taught. The F-22 Raptor represented the pinnacle of American aerospace engineering, a fighter so advanced that Congress had banned its export to allies, so sophisticated that its maintenance required classified procedures and security clearances. For four of them to simply vanish suggested possibilities that none of the briefing documents had considered. "Colonel," Rodriguez said quietly, "we're starting to get reports from other units in the area. Ground-based radar installations are picking up intermittent contacts at extremely high altitude. The signatures don't match anything in our identification databases." Webb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Unidentified aircraft at high altitude over Afghanistan meant one of three things: equipment malfunction, pilot error, or the presence of technology that American intelligence had failed to detect. None of those options offered much comfort. Meanwhile, Viper's A-10 continued its steady progress toward the coordinates where America's most advanced fighters had last been seen. The contrast between her aircraft and the missing Raptors couldn't have been more stark. Where they relied on stealth and sophistication, she flew a machine that survived through simplicity and stubborn endurance. Where they cost hundreds of millions of dollars apiece, her Warthog had been built with the philosophy that cheaper, simpler, and more reliable would ultimately prove more valuable than expensive, complex, and fragile. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone involved. The military that had grounded Viper for being too aggressive, too independent, and too willing to bend rules was now sending her to find pilots who had disappeared while following orders to the letter. Sometimes the very qualities that made someone unsuitable for peacetime service made them indispensable when everything went wrong. As Viper approached the target coordinates, she began her descent into the mountain valleys where four of America's most advanced fighter jets had vanished without explanation. The terrain below was unforgiving: jagged peaks, deep ravines, and areas where radar coverage became spotty and unreliable. It was the kind of landscape that had swallowed armies throughout history, where technology meant less than experience and institutional knowledge meant less than instinct. Her radio crackled with updates from the operations center, routine position reports that maintained the illusion of control and communication. But Viper knew better than most how quickly routine could become catastrophic, how easily communication could become silence, and how fast control could become chaos. She'd seen it before, in places whose names appeared in classified files and on memorial walls that most civilians would never visit. The first visual contact came at 4:23 hours, when Viper spotted wreckage scattered across a ridgeline that shouldn't have contained any wreckage at all. The debris pattern was wrong, too spread out, too random, suggesting either a catastrophic in-flight breakup or something else entirely. She banked her A-10 into a tight circle, using the aircraft's exceptional low-speed handling to get a closer look at what remained of American air superiority in the Hindu Kush. What she saw through her targeting pod's camera made her question everything she thought she knew about modern aerial warfare. The wreckage wasn't from F-22s. The pieces were too small, too numerous, and arranged in patterns that suggested they'd been deliberately placed rather than randomly scattered by impact. Someone or something had been busy in these mountains, and they'd left behind evidence of capabilities that weren't supposed to exist. Viper keyed her radio with growing urgency. "Command, this is Viper. I have eyes on debris at grid coordinates 34.6589 north, 67.7892 east. Advise you prep search and rescue assets immediately. This site is unusual." Colonel Webb's response came through clearly despite the distance and terrain. "Viper, describe what you're seeing. Are we looking at our missing aircraft?" She hesitated, knowing that her next words would trigger a cascade of decisions and responses that would ripple through the Pentagon, the White House, and intelligence agencies whose existence most military personnel only suspected. "Negative, Colonel. Whatever happened to our Raptors, this isn't it. But someone's been busy up here, and they left behind calling cards we need to analyze immediately." The silence that followed her transmission lasted exactly 43 seconds, long enough for Colonel Webb to consult with intelligence officers, long enough for classified databases to be queried, and long enough for the comfortable assumptions about American technological superiority to begin crumbling in the face of evidence that contradicted everything in the doctrine manuals. When Webb's voice returned, it carried the weight of decisions being made at levels far above his pay grade. "Viper, you are ordered to continue reconnaissance and report any additional findings. Be advised that your mission parameters have been expanded to include intelligence gathering on any evidence of foreign military technology. Use extreme caution." Viper acknowledged the transmission and continued her search pattern, knowing that she was no longer just looking for missing American pilots. She was hunting for answers to questions that might reshape how the United States understood its place in the global balance of power. The A-10's sensors and cameras continued recording everything, building a digital record of a discovery that would probably remain classified for decades. As she flew deeper into the mountain range, following valleys that seemed to lead toward increasingly remote and inaccessible terrain, Viper began to understand why the F-22s had gone silent. This wasn't just difficult flying. This was flying at the edge of what was possible, in areas where GPS signals became unreliable, where radio communication was spotty at best, and where traditional military doctrine assumed no significant threats existed. But assumptions, as Viper had learned throughout her career, were often the first casualties of actual combat. The mountains below held secrets that American intelligence had missed, capabilities that military planners hadn't considered, and threats that defense contractors had never designed their billion-dollar fighters to counter. In a world where information was supposed to travel at the speed of light, and surveillance was supposed to be comprehensive, something had found a way to remain hidden until it chose to reveal itself. The second debris field appeared on her sensors before she saw it with her eyes, a cluster of heat signatures that suggested recent activity in an area where human presence should have been impossible. Viper adjusted her course and began a careful approach, knowing that she might be flying into a trap, but understanding that gathering intelligence sometimes required accepting calculated risks. What she found at the second site changed everything she thought she knew about the missing F-22s and the nature of the threat they had encountered. The debris here was clearly American, pieces of stealth fighter that had been carefully collected, analyzed, and arranged with the methodical precision of a forensics investigation. Someone had shot down at least one Raptor, studied its wreckage, and learned everything they could about America's most advanced fighter jet technology. But the implications went deeper than simple intelligence gathering. The arrangement of the debris, the tools marks visible on critical components, and the systematic way in which classified systems had been dismantled suggested a level of technological sophistication that matched or exceeded American capabilities. This wasn't the work of insurgents with shoulder-fired missiles. This was the signature of a peer-level adversary operating with capabilities that American intelligence had failed to detect. Viper's radio crackled with an incoming transmission from Colonel Webb. "Viper, we're receiving satellite intelligence that shows significant activity in your area over the past 72 hours. Multiple aircraft contacts, ground vehicle movements, and what appears to be a temporary forward operating base. Be advised that you may not be alone up there." She scanned the horizon with renewed urgency, knowing that her slow, ungainly, would be easy prey for modern fighters if they chose to engage. But she also knew that her mission had evolved beyond simple reconnaissance. She was now gathering intelligence that could determine whether the United States faced a new kind of threat, one that could neutralize America's technological advantages and challenge fundamental assumptions about air superiority. The third discovery came as she followed a ridgeline toward coordinates that her GPS system insisted were empty wilderness. Her targeting pod picked up thermal signatures that indicated recent human activity, campfires that had been extinguished within the past few hours, vehicle tracks that led into areas where no vehicles should have been able to travel, and the distinctive heat patterns left by aircraft engines that had been shut down but were still cooling. Someone had established a sophisticated operation in some of the most remote terrain on Earth, and they'd done it without triggering any of the sensors and surveillance systems that were supposed to monitor this part of Afghanistan. The implications were staggering. If an adversary could operate undetected in areas where American forces maintained comprehensive situational awareness, then every assumption about battlefield dominance needed to be reconsidered. As Viper maneuvered her A-10 through increasingly treacherous terrain, following leads that seemed to point toward a threat that existing military doctrine couldn't adequately address, she began to understand why she'd been chosen for this mission. The F-22 pilots had been highly trained professionals who followed procedures, respected protocols, and operated within clearly defined parameters. But this situation required someone willing to improvise, to take risks that by-the-book pilots wouldn't consider, and to make decisions that might violate standing orders if the circumstances demanded it. Her radio crackled again with an update from the operations center. "Viper, be advised that we've lost contact with the Navy SEAL teams that were operating in your area. Last communication was approximately 6 hours ago. Your mission now includes searching for any signs of our ground assets." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She was no longer just hunting for missing F-22s or investigating foreign military capabilities. She was looking for American servicemen who might be captured, wounded, or worse. The mission had evolved from reconnaissance to potential rescue, and the stakes had risen accordingly. Viper pushed her A-10 deeper into the mountain range, following thermal signatures and debris trails that seemed to lead toward answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. The aircraft responded with the steady reliability that had made it legendary among pilots who flew in conditions where sophistication mattered less than durability. Every control input felt familiar, every system response was predictable, and every indication suggested that whatever had overwhelmed America's most advanced fighters would find the Warthog a very different kind of opponent. The revelation came at 4:56 hours, when Viper's targeting system locked onto a heat signature that resolved into something impossible. A partially buried F-22 Raptor that appeared to be intact, but had somehow been forced down in terrain that should have been inaccessible to any aircraft. The fighter's stealth coating was unmarked, its systems appeared undamaged, and its position suggested a controlled landing rather than a crash. But controlled landings in mountain valleys, surrounded by peaks that rose thousands of feet above the aircraft's location, were aerodynamically impossible. The F-22's performance envelope simply didn't include the kind of short-field capability that would be required to land in such restricted terrain. Yet there it was, sitting in a narrow valley like it had been placed there deliberately. Viper circled the downed Raptor while her cameras recorded every detail, knowing that what she was seeing would trigger investigations that reached the highest levels of government. An intact F-22 in enemy hands represented an intelligence disaster of unprecedented proportions. Every classified system, every proprietary technology, every operational capability could be compromised if hostile forces gained access to the aircraft. But as she continued her reconnaissance, Viper began to notice details that suggested the situation was even more complex than it initially appeared. The F-22's canopy was open, but there was no sign of the pilot. Emergency equipment that should have been deployed after an emergency landing remained stowed. Most critically, the aircraft's engines showed no signs of the kind of damage that would force an emergency landing. They appeared to be in perfect working condition. Someone or something had convinced a highly trained F-22 pilot to land his multi-million-dollar fighter in terrain where takeoff would be impossible, then disappear without deploying any survival equipment or emergency beacons. The scenario violated every assumption about pilot training, aircraft capabilities, and threat assessment that formed the foundation of American air power doctrine. As Viper continued documenting the scene, her radio erupted with an emergency transmission that changed everything about her mission and her understanding of what was happening in the mountains of Afghanistan. The voice was American, transmitted on emergency frequencies, and carried the unmistakable stress of someone in immediate danger. Any station, this is Reaper 2-1. We are under attack by unknown aircraft. Repeat, unknown aircraft engaging American forces. We need immediate assistance at grid coordinates. The transmission dissolved into static, then silence. Viper's blood ran cold as she realized that the missing F-22s and Navy SEALs weren't just victims of equipment failure or operational mistakes. They were casualties of an engagement with an enemy that possessed capabilities American intelligence had failed to detect. Somewhere in these mountains, American servicemen were fighting for their lives against opponents who had demonstrated the ability to neutralize the most advanced military technology in the world. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the static with urgent clarity. "Viper, did you copy that transmission? We need immediate reconnaissance of the coordinates provided. Be advised that rules of engagement are now weapons-free. You are authorized to engage any hostile forces threatening American personnel." She banked her A-10 toward the coordinates from the emergency transmission, knowing that she was flying into a combat situation where the normal advantages of American military technology might not apply. But she also knew that somewhere ahead of her, fellow Americans were in trouble, and that was ultimately the only consideration that mattered. The A-10's gun system came online with a familiar vibration through the airframe, and Viper felt the familiar mixture of fear and determination that preceded every mission where lives hung in the balance. The thermal signatures appeared on her targeting system before she could see them with her eyes. Multiple heat sources moving through terrain that should have been impassable, heading toward coordinates that matched the emergency transmission. But as her sensors resolved the contacts into identifiable shapes, Viper found herself looking at something that shouldn't have existed. Aircraft that moved with the speed and agility of modern fighters, but produced thermal signatures unlike anything in the American military database. She was witnessing the deployment of technology that represented a fundamental shift in the balance of military power, operated by forces that had somehow remained undetected until they chose to reveal their capabilities. The comfortable assumptions about American technological superiority were crumbling in real time, replaced by the stark reality that other nations had developed capabilities that matched or exceeded those of the United States military. As Viper approached the coordinates where American forces were reportedly under attack, she began to understand that her mission had evolved far beyond reconnaissance or rescue. She was flying into a confrontation that would determine whether the United States could maintain its position as the dominant global military power, or whether the age of American air superiority was coming to an end in the mountains of Afghanistan. The first visual contact with enemy forces came as Viper crested a ridgeline and found herself looking down into a valley where a running battle was in progress. American ground forces, clearly the missing Navy SEALs, had taken defensive positions among rocky outcroppings, but they were being systematically engaged by aircraft that seemed to ignore the traditional rules of aerial combat. The enemy fighters moved with impossible agility, appearing and disappearing behind mountain peaks in ways that suggested either revolutionary flight control technology or pilots with skills that exceeded anything in American military experience. But what struck Viper most forcefully wasn't the enemy's capabilities. It was the discipline and determination of the Americans under fire. Despite facing opponents with superior technology and advantageous positioning, the SEALs were maintaining organized resistance, using terrain and tactics to offset their disadvantages. They were buying time for rescue that might never come, fighting a battle they probably couldn't win, because that's what American military personnel do when the situation becomes impossible. Viper keyed her radio with grim determination. "Command, this is Viper. I have visual contact with friendly forces under attack by unknown aircraft. The hostiles are using technology and tactics that don't match any known military doctrine. I am engaging immediately." Colonel Webb's response came through clearly despite the static and interference. "Viper, be advised that you are cleared hot. Repeat, you are cleared to engage hostile forces with any means necessary. Additional support assets are en route but will not arrive for at least 30 minutes. You are on your own until then." She rolled her A-10 into an attack dive, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether American servicemen lived or died, and whether the United States would face the future from a position of strength or acknowledge a new reality where other nations possessed military capabilities that American intelligence had failed to anticipate. The GAU-8 cannon spun up with its characteristic whine, and Viper felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders as she prepared to engage enemies who might represent the future of warfare. The first burst from the A-10's cannon announced her presence to everyone in the valley, 30mm depleted uranium rounds that could penetrate tank armor and destroy hardened targets with devastating effectiveness. But as the rounds reached the area where her targeting system indicated enemy aircraft should be, Viper watched in disbelief as they seemed to pass through empty air. The hostiles had moved with impossible speed, repositioning themselves before her relatively slow projectiles could reach their intended targets. She was fighting enemies who could outmaneuver cannon fire, a capability that challenged fundamental assumptions about close air support and ground attack missions. The A-10 had been designed to survive in environments where enemy fighters had been neutralized by air superiority assets. But now, she found herself alone against opponents who possessed speed and agility that made the Warthog's legendary durability irrelevant if she couldn't hit them. But Viper had spent her entire career learning to adapt, improvise, and overcome obstacles that textbook solutions couldn't address. If conventional tactics wouldn't work against these enemies, she would invent new ones. The A-10 might be slower than the hostile aircraft, but it was more maneuverable at low speeds, more durable against defensive fire, and capable of operating in terrain where faster aircraft couldn't safely follow. She dropped her altitude until she was flying barely above the valley floor, using mountain peaks and ridgelines as cover while she repositioned for another attack. The enemy aircraft seemed to prefer high-altitude engagements, where their speed advantages were most pronounced, but Viper intended to force them into the kind of low-altitude, terrain-following fight where the A-10's characteristics might level the playing field. The radio crackled with transmissions from the embattled SEAL team, their voices carrying the controlled urgency of professional soldiers under extreme pressure. "Viper, this is Reaper 2-1. We have wounded and are running low on ammunition. The hostiles appear to be regrouping for another attack. Whatever you're going to do, now would be a good time." She acknowledged the transmission while maneuvering through terrain that pushed her aircraft to its operational limits, knowing that the Americans below were counting on her to neutralize threats that conventional military doctrine insisted shouldn't exist. The weight of their trust was both inspiring and terrifying. Inspiring, because it represented the kind of faith that held military units together under impossible circumstances. Terrifying because she wasn't sure her capabilities matched the expectations placed on her. The second engagement began when one of the enemy aircraft made the mistake of pursuing the A-10 into a narrow canyon, where superior speed became a disadvantage rather than an asset. Viper had deliberately led her opponent into terrain that restricted maneuverability, betting that her experience flying in confined spaces would give her an edge over pilots accustomed to operating in open airspace. The gamble paid off when the enemy fighter overshot her position while attempting to maintain pursuit speed in an environment that demanded precision rather than velocity. Viper reversed course with the kind of tight turn that only the A-10 could manage at such low airspeeds, bringing her nose around to bear on an opponent who was suddenly flying away from her rather than toward her. The GAU-8 cannon fired again, this time with devastating effect. The enemy aircraft disintegrated under the impact of 30mm rounds designed to destroy main battle tanks, proving that despite their advanced capabilities, the hostile forces weren't invulnerable to properly applied firepower. The wreckage scattered across the canyon floor, leaving behind debris that would probably be classified at the highest levels once intelligence analysts had a chance to examine it. But Viper's moment of triumph was short-lived, as the remaining enemy aircraft responded to their comrades' destruction with tactics that demonstrated both sophistication and ruthlessness. Instead of engaging her directly, they began targeting the American ground forces with precision strikes designed to force her into defensive positions where their speed and altitude advantages could be maximized. She found herself facing a tactical dilemma that military training had never adequately prepared her for: how to provide close air support against enemies who could use the people she was trying to protect as leverage in aerial combat. Every time she maneuvered to attack the hostile aircraft, they would reposition to threaten the SEALs, forcing her to choose between pressing her attacks and protecting American lives. The solution came from an unexpected source: her understanding of the enemy's psychology and tactical preferences. The hostile forces had demonstrated advanced technology and sophisticated tactics, but they were also displaying the kind of methodical, systematic approach that suggested they were following predetermined procedures rather than adapting to unexpected situations. They were fighting according to doctrine, which meant they might be predictable if she could understand their operational patterns. Viper began flying in a pattern designed to convince the enemy aircraft that she was retreating, gradually increasing altitude and apparent distance from the embattled SEAL team. The hostile forces responded exactly as she hoped, moving to capitalize on what they interpreted as American withdrawal by positioning themselves for a coordinated attack on the ground forces. But instead of continuing her apparent retreat, Viper suddenly reversed course and dove toward the valley floor at maximum speed, using gravity to overcome the A-10's inherent velocity limitations. The enemy aircraft, caught in the middle of their attack formation, suddenly found themselves facing an opponent who was approaching from an unexpected direction at an unprecedented speed. The third engagement was over in seconds. Viper's cannon fire caught two enemy aircraft while they were committed to their attack runs, unable to maneuver defensively without abandoning their assault on American forces. The 30mm rounds that had missed their targets in the first engagement found their marks in the third, destroying both hostiles with the kind of precision that comes from understanding both enemy capabilities and limitations. The remaining enemy aircraft withdrew immediately, apparently unwilling to continue the engagement without numerical superiority. Viper watched them disappear over distant ridgelines, knowing that she had won a tactical victory, but understanding that the strategic implications of the encounter would reverberate through military and intelligence communities for years to come. As she circled the valley to assess the situation, Viper could see the American ground forces emerging from their defensive positions, moving with the careful professionalism of soldiers who understood that the immediate threat had passed, but that danger remained omnipresent. The radio crackled with transmissions, coordinating medical evacuation for wounded personnel and extraction procedures for classified equipment that had been compromised during the engagement. Colonel Webb's voice cut through the operational chatter with a transmission that carried implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Viper, outstanding work. Be advised that your engagement with unknown aircraft has been classified at the highest levels. You are ordered to return to base immediately for debriefing by personnel who will be arriving within the next few hours. She acknowledged the transmission while beginning her return flight, knowing that the next few hours would involve questions she couldn't answer completely and implications she couldn't fully understand. The engagement had demonstrated that American military personnel could adapt and overcome, even when facing enemies with superior technology. But it had also revealed vulnerabilities in intelligence gathering and threat assessment that went to the heart of national security planning. As the A-10 climbed away from the valley where American and hostile forces had clashed for the first time, Viper reflected on the broader meaning of what had just occurred. The United States had built its military doctrine around the assumption of technological superiority, but that assumption had been challenged in a way that demanded fundamental reconsideration of strategic planning and force structure decisions. The enemy aircraft she had engaged possessed capabilities that represented either revolutionary advances in aerospace technology or operational concepts that American military planners had failed to anticipate. Either possibility suggested that the comfortable certainty of American military dominance was ending, replaced by a more complex and dangerous international environment where other nations could challenge the United States on equal terms. But the engagement had also demonstrated something equally important, that American military personnel, when properly led and adequately equipped, could prevail even against technically superior opponents through superior training, tactical flexibility, and the kind of determination that comes from fighting for principles worth defending. The Navy SEALs had maintained organized resistance despite facing impossible odds, and a single A-10 pilot had neutralized threats that should have overwhelmed her capabilities. As Viper approached Bagram Airfield, she could see unusual activity on the flight line, aircraft that didn't belong to regular military units, ground vehicles with markings she didn't recognize, and personnel whose uniforms suggested intelligence agencies rather than conventional military commands. Her debriefing would obviously involve more than routine after-action reporting. The landing was routine, but the atmosphere was anything but normal. Ground crews directed her to a secure area of the airfield where her A-10 would be inspected by specialists, whose security clearances probably exceeded her own. The wreckage of enemy aircraft that she had destroyed would be recovered and analyzed by experts who would determine whether the United States faced a new kind of threat or had simply encountered the advanced guard of capabilities that other nations had been developing in secret. As Viper shut down her engines and began post-flight procedures, she understood that her career had reached another turning point. The pilot who had been grounded for 18 months due to aggressive tactics and insubordination had just prevented a potential intelligence disaster and demonstrated that unconventional approaches might be necessary to address unconventional threats. Colonel Webb was waiting for her as she climbed down from the cockpit, his expression carrying the weight of decisions that would probably be made at levels far above his authority. "Major Volkov, I want you to understand that what happened today changes everything. Your actions probably saved American lives and prevented classified technology from falling into hostile hands. But the implications of this engagement go far beyond tactical success." She nodded, understanding that the comfortable assumptions about air superiority and technological dominance were giving way to a more complex reality, where other nations possessed capabilities that American intelligence had failed to detect. The engagement had been won, but the war for information dominance was just beginning. The debriefing facility was unlike anything Viper had experienced, a secure area where intelligence analysts, military planners, and officials, whose agencies she could only guess at, would spend hours examining every detail of her encounter with enemies who possessed capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. The questions would be detailed, the implications would be classified, and the conclusions would probably influence military planning for decades to come. As she walked toward the debriefing facility, Viper reflected on the irony of her situation. The military establishment that had questioned her judgment and tactical decisions was now depending on her observations to understand threats that existing doctrine couldn't adequately address. The pilot who had been considered too aggressive and independent was now the primary source of intelligence about enemies who had demonstrated the ability to neutralize America's most advanced military systems. The door to the debriefing facility opened to reveal a room full of people whose security clearances and analytical capabilities would determine how the United States responded to the revelation that its military technological superiority was no longer guaranteed. Maps covered the walls. Communication equipment linked the facility to command centers around the world, and computer systems processed classified information that would reshape American defense planning. But as Viper took her seat at the conference table where officials from multiple agencies waited to hear her account of the engagement, she understood that the most important questions wouldn't be about enemy capabilities or technological advantages. They would be about whether American military personnel could adapt quickly enough to address threats that existing training and doctrine hadn't prepared them to face. The colonel in charge of the debriefing was someone she didn't recognize, wearing uniforms that suggested special operations commands or intelligence agencies that operated in the shadows of conventional military structures. His first question cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Major Volkov, in your professional opinion, do the aircraft you engaged represent a fundamental shift in the global balance of military power?" She considered the question carefully, knowing that her answer would influence planning decisions that could affect American security for decades to come. The enemy aircraft had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of known military systems, but they had also shown limitations that could be exploited by properly trained personnel using appropriate tactics. "Sir," she replied, "the aircraft I engaged possessed advanced capabilities, but they weren't invincible. They could be outmaneuvered, they could be destroyed, and their pilots made tactical errors that could be exploited. The question isn't whether we can defeat these systems. Today's engagement proves that we can. The question is whether we can adapt our training and tactics quickly enough to maintain our operational advantages." The room fell silent as officials processed the implications of her assessment. American military superiority wasn't ending, but it was evolving into something more complex, requiring new approaches to training, equipment development, and strategic planning. The comfortable certainty of technological dominance was giving way to a more demanding reality where success would depend on human factors, training, adaptability, and determination, rather than simply superior equipment. The debriefing continued for hours, covering every aspect of the engagement from technical details about enemy aircraft performance to tactical decisions that had determined the outcome of aerial combat. But as the questions progressed, Viper began to understand that she wasn't just providing information. She was helping to define a new approach to air warfare that would influence American military doctrine for generations to come. The sun was setting over the Afghan mountains when the debriefing finally concluded, and Viper found herself facing a decision that would determine the rest of her military career. The officials who had questioned her were offering something that 18 months ago would have seemed impossible, not just reinstatement to flight status, but assignment to a classified program that would develop new tactics and training programs to address the kinds of threats she had encountered.